Sometimes I sit at my desk, procrastinating in front of a blank page while I try to concoct a spicy opener for my next talk. Today, though, my creative powers have failed. I do have a joke about the Ship of Theseus, but it's not original. Okay, so who is Theseus, and why should you care about his hobo flotilla? Basically, some dude had a boat, he died, and people liked his boat, so they made a whole festival around it. Eventually, the boat started to fall apart, and they needed to replace parts on it so they could continue festiving, as one does. Then some smart guys who didn't have anything else to worry about, like paying for housing or health insurance, well, they decided to make up a problem where one was not needed. They asked, if we keep replacing stuff on our vintage party boat, is it still the same boat? Apparently, this was a really good question, as it's been debated repeatedly over millennia by similarly eccentric philosophers disconnected from real problems facing humanity. And so here we are today, doing exactly the same thing. So splice that main brace and set sail with me to help those crusty philosophers figure some stuff out. Sorry in advance. Okay, so the conundrum here is that we have some object. In this particular case, it's a boat. It could technically be anything, but it probably makes the most sense if our object is particularly long-lasting and liable to have some components periodically replaced. Like a building or a video game that's been in alpha pre-release for the past 5 years, or your crotchety 17-year-old one-eyed cat. And what keeps some philosophers up at night is the question of if and when our object, which is continually being updated with new parts, becomes a different object. But do the components identify the object? I don't consider myself to be a new person every time one of my liver cells replicates, or every time I eat a hamburger and incorporate some unfortunate cow's amino acids into my own proteins. Of course, I am presumably conscious, and a boat, presumably, is not. Does consciousness matter when determining whether or not the components of an object identify it? Well, first we need to determine what we mean by object. Okay, but seriously, separating all of existence into separate objects is an abstraction performed only within consciousness. I need to be conscious to identify my own righteous seafaring vessel as a yacht, and my neighbor's haphazard pile of smelly scrapwood as merely a barge. And if I strap a sled to a dolphin, is it also a boat, or just a trigger warning for PETA? The Ship of Theseus is an abstraction rather than an object, and as such, its identity is determined by language more so than by physical reality. But let's bring this idea to port. First, let's look at the word ship. This is our abstraction, roughly, for some assemblage of matter intended to float upon water and transit stuff across it. If we were to disassemble Theseus' ship and build a coffee table with the pieces, it would no longer be the Ship of Theseus, the same object, even though it was built of the same original materials. Logically, it would be the coffee table of Theseus, and he would also get far fewer dates. Now, the second part of the identifier is the words of Theseus. This implies that the object, whether it be ship or table, must belong to Theseus. If he were to gift it to his neighbor Celsius, and yes, I'm an American, but his neighbor will not be Fahrenheit because that's a dumb name for a neighbor, even a patriotic one, and who can even spell that? Anyways, it would no longer, obviously, be the Ship of Theseus. Similarly, if we were to use some of the components of the original ship to build a second ship, also owned by Theseus, while replacing those components in the original with new material, then Theseus would now own 2 ships. Good for him. But which one is the Ship of Theseus? Well, if you ask him, Theseus would quite rightly and defensively claim that they are both his, except, of course, for tax purposes. To avoid confusion, though, it's best not to refer to 2 separate objects with the same name. We could call one of them Ship 1 and the other one Ship 2, which is which, it doesn't really matter. At this point, the naming convention is purely logistical. But we're a bit adrift. Let's steer this conversation back on course. In short, the components don't identify the object. Your mind identifies the object. So if it makes sense to you to conceptualize the continuity of your boat, even when it used to be your grandfather's boat and none of the original parts remain, then cool, do it. And like those ancient philosophers, if you too don't have any earthly plebeian concerns, then by all means theorize about when your old boat becomes a new boat, even though it's still the same boat and you're doing the exact same thing with it every single day. Now, if my answer to this age-old problem doesn't land with you, there have been plenty of other aloof philosophers over the ages, and even in the modern day, who've come to differing conclusions. For example, that an object is defined both by its physicality and the point in time in which we identify it, and that no object is truly the same across time. Or that object continuity persists only as long as you don't replace all of the components of said object at the same time, in which case it would be a new object. But this conclusion sounds a bit technical and susceptible to loopholes. I certainly wouldn't want to bet my livelihood on this definition in court. Language is complicated. It's our best attempt to convert the subjective into the objective. Sometimes it's really important to be precise. A spacefaring vessel, for example, might fail horrendously if we accidentally swap English for metric units. Side note, did anyone else watch For All Mankind? But anyways, when that vessel bursts into a brilliant inferno on the launch pad and is then hastily salvaged and rebuilt before government funding and public sentiment runs out, the decision to call it a new vessel, or the same vessel, version 2.0, is largely semantic. Or in this case, perhaps bureaucratic, but you get my point. Anyways, if you're trying to figure out how to put your kids through college or find a career that simultaneously provides fulfillment and pays a living wage, you probably have more important things to worry about than the correct pronouns or other identifying criteria for a mythical dead man's boat. Thanks for listening. Now, before you raise anchor and continue with your voyage, let me share the wise words of the venerable ChatGPT 4.0, which says, and I quote, "So whether you're patching up your proverbial ship or debating whether your restored muscle car is authentic, remember this. Life's a sea of changes, and it's the ride, not the planks, that make it worth sailing." What even is this?